Well, good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It is called McDuff_2020. And tonight I'm going to have a special presentation on NSAM 57. It's been in the news lately and gives us a lot of hope that perhaps the president is going to rein in the CIA as Kennedy tried to do. If Trump can possibly pull that off, can he do it without a second term? Does he feel like he has to do it without a second term? Does he feel like right now is the time to launch an effort to retake control over our out-of-control secret operations? Is this the time when NSAM 57 comes into effect? You know, it's been on the books a long time. So I thought I would give everybody a review of the text that I have from Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty that explains the whole thing, because he was right smack in the middle of it at the time. Let's start off by referring to what's going on here now. The idea is that Christopher Miller, the new I think a Secretary of Defense, is now in charge of the special operations, that the CIA or anybody else that wants to run something has to go through the Office of Secretary of Defense, the OSD. Well, it was the OSD where SACSA was, and SACSA was supposed to be implementing NSAM 57, and that, of course, was my dad's career. So this is all coming into very, very close quarters here, with my dad's story coming together with Kennedy and with Trump now making an attempt to do what Kennedy did, and apparently cost Kennedy his life. They certainly didn't want Kennedy to have a second term, and I think the same people are fighting against Trump right now. So let's think about this tonight as we delve back into the pages of the Secret Team one more time to mine the gold from Fletcher Prouty, who tells us all the inside story right here in his book, The Secret Team. Hi, John, will you please end with music tonight? Hey, Kathy Sue. You asked me 3 times, how can I say no? I will see what I can come up with for you. I hadn't expected the request, but we'll see what we can come up with. Let's see. Yeah, I've been interested in what's going on in Washington, D.C. today. You know, I turned over to, I think, OANN, one of the networks that's up and coming, that's going to be hopefully supporting the president as opposed to all the rest of the networks we're saddled with. But they had, you know, the stage, and it was Alex Jones talking. And he was talking about Jesus and you know, how our nation is, you know, built on Christian values, and, you know, very much of an emotional appeal. He seemed to be like almost like a hard-shell church Baptist preacher, and I didn't like it. You know, I'm not against religion. I'm not against, you know, all of that stuff, but you know, this is not a battle over religion. This is a battle over the Constitution. And it's the Constitution in which we have to find our strength. God gave us the Constitution, if you want to look at it that way. But from my point of view, as somebody who's worked as a lawyer for 40 years, you have to use the law. You have to. If you don't use the law, if all you're going to do is pray, then you know, you're going to end up a victim. You may get to heaven, you know, you may get to heaven faster than I do, but you're going to end up a victim. That's my experience, you know. So let's get into the details tonight, after I have a sip of my hot ginger beverage. Okay, I'm putting up on the screen just for the record, and you can, if you want to look at it in detail, you can freeze the replay later and read the whole thing. But the three NSAMs came out together June of 1961, and this one is number 55. It's the first one, and it's the one that really opens up the floodgates for Kennedy's attempt to rein in the CIA. And so I'm just going to read it. National Security Action Memorandum number 55, June 25th, 1961. Now, just for the record, at this time, my father is still over at the Washington field office on Pennsylvania Avenue in what is now the Trump Hotel, Trump Tower in Washington, the old post office building, we always call it, us locals. And in the old post office building is where he was working as part of the counterintelligence section of the Washington field office under J. Edgar Hoover. And so nobody's touched my father yet about the idea of coming to the Joint Chiefs, just to set the stage. Okay, so this in NSAM 55 is directed to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And at that time, that was General Leimnitzer, Leimnitzer, who may be famous or infamous to you already as the author of the Operation Northwoods plan, the plan that would have a American civil airliner shot down in a false flag event over Florida to be an instigation for an invasion of Cuba. Well, it was a plan. It wasn't accepted, thank God, and we didn't do that. But other than that, let's just let Fletcher Prouty's evaluation of General Leimnitzer take precedence over any ill feelings we have about that, because I think his career working together probably gives us a much better picture. So this is directed to the chairman. Subject: relations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the President in Cold War operations. I wish to inform the Joint Chiefs of Staff as follows with regard to my views of their relations to me in Cold War operations. A. I regard the Joint Chiefs of Staff as my principal military advisor, responsible both for initiating advice to me and for responding to requests for advice. I expect their advice to come to me direct and unfiltered. Now, is that not a slap at the CIA? I don't think I've ever seen one. Okay? This is right after the Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs, April, NSAM 55, June. B. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have responsibility for the defense of the nation in the Cold War, similar to that which they have in conventional hostilities. They should know the military and paramilitary forces and resources available to the Department of Defense, verify their readiness, report on their adequacy, and make appropriate recommendations for their expansion and improvement. I look to the chiefs to contribute dynamic and imaginative leadership to contributing to the success of the military and paramilitary aspects of Cold War programs. C, I expect the Joint Chiefs of Staff to present the military viewpoint in governmental councils in such a way as to ensure that the military factors are clearly understood before decisions are reached. When only the chairman or a single chief is present, that officer must represent the chiefs as a body, taking such preliminary and subsequent actions as may be necessary to assure that he does in fact represent the corporate judgment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. D. While I look to the chiefs to present the military factor without reserve or hesitation, I regard them to be more than military men and expect their help in fitting military requirements into the overall context of any situation, recognizing that the most difficult problem in government is to combine all assets in a unified, effective pattern. And then he shows a copy to the Secretary of Defense, General Taylor. Also to McGeorge Bundy, significantly. Okay, that is NSAM 55. NSAM 56, same date. Subject evaluation of paramilitary requirements. The President has approved the following paragraph. Quote, it is important that we anticipate now our possible future requirements in the field of unconventional warfare and paramilitary operations. A first step would be to inventory the paramilitary assets we have in the United States Armed Forces, consider various areas in the world where the implementation of our policy may require indigenous paramilitary forces, and thus arrive at a determination of the goals which we should act in this field, the goals which we should set in this field, Having determined the assets and the possible requirements, it would then become a matter of developing a plan to meet the deficit. Unquote. The President requests that the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Department of State and the CIA, make such an estimate of requirements and recommend ways and means to meet those requirements. Signed, McGeorge Bundy. And then finally, NSAM 57, responsibility in paramilitary operations. And this again is directed to the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director CIA. The President has approved the attached recommendation. The special group, the 5412 Committee, will perform the functions assigned in the recommendations to the Strategic Resources Group. Signed, McGeorge Bundy, copy to General Maxwell Taylor. So, and if you want, you can go and see all of the NSAMs at the FAS Intelligence Documents site, fas.org, which is where I got it. Now, let's turn for a moment to, turn our attention now to Fletcher Prouty, and let's start with his job description. Now let's recall Fletcher Prouty is Air Force. He was Army Air Force in World War II and probably the most important pilot, in that he was shuttling President Roosevelt and all the dignitaries around to the conferences, and he did an amazing career, which it's impossible for me to summarize except for to say he's one of the most important Army, Air Force, and Air Force officers of the 20th century. Beyond that, he's a great historian and writer of what he saw, as we got the benefit of his two great books, The Secret Team and JFK, which I, of course, have read on the show. So this is his job description. It's called Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, parentheses, Special Operations, close parentheses. And this was 1959. Okay, so this is before Kennedy. But he's there when Kennedy arrives. Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Special Operations is the principal staff assistant to the Secretary of Defense in the functional fields of intelligence, counterintelligence, communications security, Central Intelligence Agency relationship and special operations, and psychological warfare operations. He performs functions in his assigned fields of responsibility, such as recommending policies and guidance governing Department of Defense planning and program development, reviewing plans and programs of the military departments for carrying out approved policies, and evaluating the administration and management of approved plans and programs as a basis on which to recommend to the Secretary of Defense necessary actions to provide for more effective, efficient, and economical administration and operations and the elimination of duplication. Reviewing the development and execution of plans and programs of the National Security Agency and related activities of the Department of Defense. Developing Department of Defense positions and providing for the Department of Defense support in connection with special operations activities of the United States government. As appropriate, with military departments and other Department of Defense agencies having collateral or related functions, and maintains liaison with Department of State, Director of Central Intelligence and the CIA, the USIA, and other U.S. and foreign government organizations. He's authorized to issue instructions appropriate to carrying out policies approved by the Secretary of Defense for his assigned areas of responsibility. The Assistant to the Secretary of Defense Special Ops is appointed by the Secretary of Defense. So that was a status in 1959. That was Fletcher Prouty was the Assistant Secretary for Special Operations. And it was his job then to put together whatever team of military assets was needed for the CIA to accomplish its goals. And this is the situation as we go into the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War, and also Kennedy's accession to the White House. Let's go over here and say hi to you guys in the chat room. Okay, now let's go to the secret team and read what Fletcher Prouty tells us about these three memorandums, NSAM 55, 56, 57. On page 481 of the secret team, and let's preface it by reminding everyone that it's the CIA that's running the Vietnam War, also in Laos, and has, Air Force base in Thailand, and but it's the CIA, it's their operation, and what Prouty has to do is to supply them with the military assets that they want. As the military assets increase, the ability of the CIA to manage it decreases. Because honestly, they're not a big enough organization to run, an army, a division. I mean, how many activities going on at once can a small agency keep track of? That's part of why the whole thing was such a mess. So Kennedy, of course, inherits that situation. You've got the CIA using the military, but under CIA command through the ambassador. The ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., the son of our very racist Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr. of the Boston Brahmins that was a senator for so long. Well, now we've got the son running the ambassador's office, which really all he did was give, I think Lansdale was the CIA operative in charge at that time. So he just basically was there to perform a chain of command duty, but the real decisions were being made by the CIA. Also, you know who General Krulak is by now. General Victor Brute Krulak was the first SACSA, the first actual, the head of the agency is called the SACSA, and he was the first one. He's a Marine general, and we'll hear a little bit about him. At the time, 1963 to 64, the ambassador could have been withdrawn in favor of the military commander, and as the escalation went into effect, then the CIA chief should have been relegated to the fourth force role he should have had in a wartime situation. Every U.S. Army combat soldier in Vietnam, excepting a few assigned to such offices as the legitimate MAAG section, was under the operational control and direction of the CIA. It was only after the beginning of real escalation that the Army soldiers under Army generals began to take over certain roles and missions and areas in Vietnam. They never did take over full responsibility for what was called a war. One reason for this was that there never was a real honest-to-God military objective of this war. There never has been in Vietnam that objective, which, when achieved by military force, would have spelled victory. There never has been that battle which, if won, would assure victory. Of course, the counterinsurgency supporters have said, yes, that's the nature of this type of warfare. You can't beat insurgents that way. That is nonsense. When a nation is ready to demand from its people 55,000 lives and more than $200 billion of its wealth as a contribution to some foreign action, it should at least have an objective that can be achieved in a tangible manner so that no one can tell when it has been reached or when such attainment is beyond reach. What has happened in Vietnam is that the CIA got in over its head, and the Army was sent in to attempt to bring some order out of the chaos that existed there after the assassination of President Diem. Only then, when the Marines and the Army arrived, were troops serving under the actual command and direction of their generals. One of the real reasons the Army got in there in the first place was because when the Marines came in, they refused to take the field under the CIA. By that time, General Krulak, formerly the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities on the Joint Staff, and then Commanding General of Fleet Marine Forces Pacific, knew too much about the CIA and its activities to permit his Marines to hit the beaches of Indochina under any command other than Marine and the U.S. Military Command Vietnam. So, that's some extreme stuff. You have General Krulak, who was the SACSA, and you may have seen the show when I showed you a picture of my father and my mother, and then directly between the two of them is General Krulak. This was at a party, a reception for General Krulak that my parents attended. And that General Krulak was my dad's first boss at SACSA. So they knew each other, and probably quite well. And they would have had the same attitude that the CIA got in over its head, that they should never have been in a position to be acting like generals, which they're not trained to do. And so a real military-oriented person, like my dad, from World War II, brothers in arms, comrades in arms, these folks, they stick together. And then these spooks come in and start insinuating themselves into the command positions. And of course, we've told that story many times of how Maxwell Taylor comes into SACSA, but that's getting ahead of our story tonight. But is it not telling that after having spent, I think, a year and a half or so as the SACSA, or even 2 years, that General Krulak knew the CIA well enough to say, no way am I sending my Marines into Indochina under the command of the CIA. Serious breach in policy between Krulak and the CIA. Kennedy undoubtedly saw the beginnings of this serious problem after the Bay of Pigs investigation. At that point, he wrote 2 very powerful National Security Action Memoranda, NSAM 55 and NSAM 57. Both were issued from the White House in June of 1961. NSAM 55 was a brief memorandum of great significance, which was addressed directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was signed personally by the President. In essence, it said that Jack Kennedy would hold the chairman, Leimnitzer, responsible for all action of a military nature during peacetime in the same manner as he would hold him responsible for such action in time of war. In other words, the President was saying that he wanted any and all peacetime operations, military type, clandestine, covert, paramilitary, etc., to be under the control, or at least under the close scrutiny, of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. One way to interpret this in light of the then current events would be, no more Bay of Pigs. This was a powerful memorandum which set forth Kennedy's views without equivocation. It was, in fact, one more positive action against the non-address. It was more positive as an action against the non-addressees than it was for the addressee, the Joint Chiefs. General Lemnitzer, a fine soldier of the old and traditional school and one of the best administrators to serve after World War II, did not take advantage of this memo. He knew exactly what it meant, and he did not intend to abuse it. The best way he knew to have no more Bay of Pigs disasters was to have no more Bay of Pigs. He noted the memo, had the Joint Chiefs Red Stripe formally approve it, and then filed it for future use if needed. As far as that old soldier was concerned, the memo meant there would be no more clandestine military operations in peacetime, and that such things as Indonesia, Laos, Tibet, and the Bay of Pigs were a thing of the past. You see, nobody in the real military services wanted to run special ops. It's not the way to win a war. CIA wants to run special ops. So the idea then that what Prouty is saying is that General Lemnitzer was saying, okay, fine, I'm now in charge of special ops and there ain't going to be any. Well, that should be good news for everyone. Except the CIA. Now this is Prouty once again referring in the first person. I was the officer responsible for briefing this paper to General Lemnitzer and to the other Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that NSAM rested in my files. There need be no misunderstanding about what the memo meant, what the President meant, and what Lemnitzer understood and did, and what the other chiefs understood. This was an unusual memorandum because Kennedy sent it directly to the chairman and sent information copies only to McNamara, Rusk, and Allen Dulles. It should also be noted that Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, and Allen Dulles knew that NSAM well and understood its full meaning and intent, and they knew exactly what President Kennedy meant by it. In other words, President Kennedy, by the explicit publication of this brief memo, was letting the entire top echelon superstructure above the secret team, wherever it existed, know that from that time on there were to be no more such ill-conceived, inadequately planned, and inherently dangerous clandestine operations. If this directive had been followed explicitly, and if Kennedy had lived to assure that it was followed as he intended it to be, there is a very good chance that the United States' involvement in Indochina would never have been escalated beyond the military advisor level. 55,000 deaths followed because the CIA didn't follow NSAM 57. And that's just the American service, of course, millions of deaths, I should say. Kennedy had learned his grim lesson at the Bay of Pigs, and as his directive made clear, he was not going to become involved in that type of operation again. If evidence of this is needed, consider how he handled the missile crisis in Cuba a year later. Once he'd been convinced of the gravity of the situation, he directed the mobilization of sufficient troops overtly and challenged the Cubans and the Soviets to comply with his demands. He respected the proper employment of military power and has seen how undercover military power fails. The second memorandum, NSAM 57, though issued at the same time, was signed, as most NSAMs were, by a member of the National Security Council staff for the President. Coming as it did, paired with NSAM 55, there could have been no misunderstanding that it carried the same thrust as NSAM 55 and that it fully expressed the views of President Kennedy. Following the policy of the National Security Act of 1947 and of such other directives as NSCID 5412/2, it recognized that there might be requirements for clandestine activity from time to time. Then it went further than those earlier directives and became much more explicit. It said that any small and truly covert type of operation, quote, may be assigned, unquote, to the CIA, and that any which were larger would be the subject of special study and planning and then, quote, may be assigned to the military, that part of the military which would be sufficient only to carry out that one operation on a one-time basis. It directed that large covert operations would not be assigned to the CIA. This attempt at clarification provided the opportunity for the CIA and its fellow travelers with a chance to blow up the balloon. They counterattacked with a long and drawn-out argument about what was a small operation and what was a large one. They then proceeded to argue about what happens if the agency goes into some country with a small operation and then it expands. At what point will the CIA operation be transitioned from the CIA control to the military, solely on the basis of size, since it would be assumed that it might or might not have remained covert? The CIA argued that if it remained covert, regardless of size, no such transition could take place. The whole point of the CIA argument was to invalidate the president's controlling mechanism, which depended on a scale of size. This started some really long and heated arguments, as often happened, since the real career military, such as Lemnitzer, had very little interest in the subject anyhow. The well-drilled opposition made quite a bit of headway. After all the dust had settled, it began to appear that except for NSAM 55, which Lemnitzer had let remain in the file, Kennedy's directive had been turned into an encouragement to the CIA to go out and start small fires and count on the military to bail them out. This may seem an odd conclusion, almost funny, but it's exactly how we got into Vietnam, in spite of the directives from the White House. The secret team is perfectly capable of turning a no into a yes by its gift of irrepressible argument. I've quoted the ranking U.S. Army officer who worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense with reference to his definition of the term counterinsurgency. Now I shall add a few lines written almost exactly 1 year after the NSAM 57 arguments. In this one critical year, here's exactly how the fight came out. Quote, "A successful counterinsurgency strategy requires, therefore, the integration of all U.S. government activities in the country concerned under the central leadership of the ambassador, or, if the local situation had deteriorated to the point where U.S. armed forces were actively involved, the military area commander." In this special sense, read deteriorated, meaning expanded beyond the ability or desire of the CIA to continue to be involved, unquote. This is exactly what was happening in Laos at about the same time. The CIA had become overextended, and things were going very badly. The CIA wrote a letter to the Secretary of Defense asking relief or suggesting the abandonment of the Mio tribesmen whom they had been supporting. Recall how the trouble in Vietnam started. The CIA had been involved in a great number of brush fire operations there for a number of years in one way or another since the OSS days of 1945. These raged out of control, becoming a general conflagration by the end of 1963. At that time, there were more than 16,000 American personnel there, more or less in the ostensible role of advisory personnel. But all of these men were under the actual direction of the country team, which meant that they were under the operational direction of the CIA. Excuse me. On the when to transition concept, it will be noted that even 10 years later, and after the escalation of military manpower had reached the staggering figure of 550,000 men, to say nothing of gross amounts of civilian manpower, the central leadership was never transitioned to the military, as President Kennedy's NSAM 57 had ordered. If anyone had ever wanted an example of how far the secret team can turn things around, this is one of the best. In 1961, the President stated one thing categorically. By 1962, the Army's spokesman, actually in an Army uniform but a real CIA secret team spokesman, had totally turned this around in his counterinsurgency doctrine and definition. Then, after President Kennedy died, the secret team retained control of most of the Vietnam War, from its earliest birth pangs to the peak of escalation. Even to this day, the combat phase of the Vietnam War, which is called pacification, and which in fiscal year 1972 cost more than $1 billion, is totally under the direction and control of the CIA. Well, that was the status in 1972. So Kennedy passes his administrative orders in NSAM 55, 56, 57, June 1961. By 1963, the CIA has twisted it around to turn it into an invitation for them to start their brush fires and then call the Secretary of Defense to, Mr. Wizard, help, Mr. Wizard. That's exactly what Kennedy did not want to happen. He wanted, if it's going to be a military operation, to be run by the military. So the President has ordered Christopher Miller to now be in charge of the same system that NSAM 57 set up. And just like President Kennedy was challenged, as Fletcher Prouty explains, so is President Trump being challenged. And you know how I feel about it. You know, I want President Trump to succeed, to cut off the CIA's ability to run operations without anybody knowing it, to have their secret budgets, and to create brush fires throughout the world. Not only do they get involved in the military operations, but of course those brush fires are no longer just about fighting communism. These are about taking over territory for business purposes, for running pipelines, for clearing resource extraction areas, for keeping people from being able to develop their own resources by using special operations to come in and take them over, and of course ruining everyone's lives in the country by installing a vicious dictator that will enforce the CIA's business relationships to the detriment of the people of the country and to the benefit of the elite people for whom the CIA has always worked, not for the citizens of the United States of America. Well, it's pretty much what the content I wanted to give you tonight was, just a review of what it was like in 1963. I'll skip forward to a little bit more to read here, which I find important. So here's when Kennedy hires Krulak. There had been several temporary special assistants, such as General Hemtkes and General Craig, before it acquired its greatest and most dynamic driving force, the U.S. Marine General Victor H. Krulak. The important thing to understand is that the much heralded office of SACSA had very few military responsibilities. It was almost entirely CIA-oriented. Most of its dealings with the services were in areas in which the CIA was most active. For example, the great proportion of its dealings with the Army were strictly limited to Special Forces activity. With the Air Force, it was mostly the Special Air Warfare activity, and with the Navy, it was the SEAL teams. There were other duties, of course, but most of them gave the office something it could say it was doing while it was performing its primary task of supporting the CIA, the secret team, and of breathing life into the massive Frankenstein called counterinsurgency. SACSA played another very important role in the highest level policy discussions of this country. It has been said that Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam in 1963, but deferred it until after his re-election, as he's told Senator Mike Mansfield, because such a move would stir up a, quote, Joe McCarthy wave of sentiment and would lose him the support of the JCS. The JCS Kennedy knew best was the voice of SACSA. The one officer he saw from the Joint Staff more than any other during those crucial days was General Krulak. Technically, General Dean should have been the action man. He was the operations director of the Joint Staff, but General Dean was not the CIA's secret team man. This was because Allen Dulles and Maxwell Taylor at the time opened the door for Krulak, since Krulak's job was to support the CIA. Krulak's closest advisors were such men as Bill Bundy, a longtime CIA man on McNamara's staff, General Lansdale, and other key CIA agents and high officials. Thus, when he worked frequently with a man in the Department of Research and Engineering for whom he had been told he could get some assistance, it's quite possible he never knew that the man he got the equipment from was CIA. Later, when Maxwell Taylor had become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the only Joint Chiefs John Kennedy knew was even more CIA biased, since Maxwell Taylor himself was by that time more oriented toward the secret team than the military, and Krulak was closer than ever to the president. Thus, it was not the real military that Kennedy would have offended if he had withdrawn from Vietnam in 1963. It was the chameleon, secret team CIA military who made him think they would have objected, and who made him think that they represented the military. In this special sense, the creation of SACSA and the appointment of Maxwell Taylor as chairman of the Joint Chiefs were most influential events. It's no wonder secret team writers have made so much of the great importance to them and to the CIA of SACSA. A careful reader of the Pentagon Papers will see just how well documented all of this is, especially if he observes how many JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff papers, were actually, in reality, SACSA/Secret Team CIA papers, attributed only to the Joint Chiefs. So that's the story. SACSA was intended by Kennedy to enforce NSAM 57, and because of the infiltration of SACSA by CIA types like Maxwell Taylor, that mission was shunted aside, and the CIA continued running their operations even to the extent of the 550,000 men under Westmoreland in Vietnam, which was a CIA command. So now we come to it. Christopher Miller, President Trump, let's take care of business. Let's enforce NSAM 57. So thanks very much, everyone. Kathy Sue, I will play some music for you, but I think not tonight. It's a little bit late, and I didn't have anything prepared. But I will think of you, my dear, and play some music for you real soon. I wish everyone the best of the rest of the weekend. I'll look on the internet and see what's going on downtown. I know the big rally is over, and this is the opportunity for the Antifa thugs to come out and cause some trouble. So I hope that everything is under control and peaceful downtown. But I'm going to take a look and see what's going on. I know the great Peter Duke showed up, took some pictures down there, and flew across the country to be at this event. So I'm going to check it out myself. Thanks a lot again tonight. Thanks everybody for supporting me in so many different ways. Good night.